The desert wind carried the sting of rejection as 17-year-old Ayana stumbled through the rocky terrain, her bare feet bleeding on the sharp stones. Behind her, the smoke from her village's cooking fires had long since disappeared beyond the mesa. Along with everything she had ever known, the words of her own mother still echoed in her ears like a curse. "You bring death wherever you go, witch child. The spirits have marked you. Leave us, and never return." 3 days had passed since the tribal council's decision. 3 days since her mother had stood before the elders and declared that Ayana's strange dreams, visions that sometimes came true, were the work of dark spirits. When old Joseph Crow Feather had died the night after Ayana dreamed of blackbirds circling his hogan, the fear had been planted. When young Tommy Lightfoot's horse broke its leg on the exact trail Ayana had warned him to avoid in another dream, that fear had grown roots. And when she dreamed of the flash flood that destroyed the spring planting, even predicting which families would lose their homes, the fear had bloomed into something ugly and absolute. Now she walked alone through the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, her water almost gone, her stomach cramping with hunger. The cotton dress her mother had sewn for her last winter was torn and dirty, offering little protection against the desert's temperature swings. As the sun reached its merciless peak, Ayana sought shelter under a sparse mesquite tree, her vision beginning to blur from dehydration. In the distance, she could see a thin column of smoke rising from what looked like a small ranch. Desperation overcame caution as she forced herself to stand and continue walking toward what might be her only chance at survival. James McKenna had been mending fence alone for the better part of the morning when he saw the figure approaching his property. At first, he thought it might be a mirage. The desert played tricks on a man's eyes, especially when he'd been working under the relentless sun. But as the figure drew closer, he could see it was real. A young Apache woman, barely more than a girl, swaying on her feet as she walked. James was a man who had learned to mind his own business. At 42, he had been living alone on his small cattle ranch for the past 5 years, ever since his wife Sarah and their infant son had died in the influenza outbreak that had swept through the territory. He had grown accustomed to solitude, even preferred it. The world had taken everything he cared about, and he had responded by withdrawing from it entirely. But something about the girl's condition stirred memories of his wife's compassionate nature. Sarah would never have turned away someone in need, regardless of their race or circumstances. As the girl collapsed to her knees just 50 yards from his fence line, James found himself dropping his tools and walking toward her. "Easy there," he said quietly, approaching slowly with his hands visible. He had enough experience with the Apache to know that sudden movements could provoke fear or flight. The girl looked up at him with dark eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion, wariness, and desperate hope. Ayana studied the man before her. He was tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent under the desert sun. His brown hair was streaked with premature gray, and his blue eyes held a sadness that seemed to match her own. More importantly, he didn't look at her with the fear or disgust she had grown accustomed to seeing in recent weeks. "Water," she managed to whisper in English, a language her father had insisted she learn despite her mother's protests. "Please." James McKenna looked at this young woman, little more than a child really, and saw something that cut through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. Without a word, he unslung his canteen from his belt and held it out to her. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and he had to gently pull the canteen away to prevent her from making herself sick. "When did you last eat?" he asked, switching to the limited Apache he had learned from trading with peaceful bands over the years. Ayana looked surprised at his attempt to speak her language, though his pronunciation was rough. 3 days, she replied in English. Maybe 4. James McKenna made a decision that would change both their lives. "Can you walk to the house? It's not far." As they made their slow progress toward the modest adobe ranch house, neither of them spoke. Ayana was too weak and uncertain to ask questions, and James was questioning his own judgment. He knew the risks of harboring an Apache, especially a young woman. The relationship between the settlers and the various Apache bands in the territory was tense at best, violent at worst. There were those who would see his kindness as treason, and others who would assume the worst about his motives. But as he helped her up the steps to his porch and saw her sink gratefully into the shade, James McKenna realized that some risks were worth taking. For the first time in 5 years, his house wouldn't be empty, and perhaps that was exactly what they both needed. The first week passed in careful, measured steps toward mutual understanding. James had set up a small room for Ayana in what had once been intended as a nursery, a space that had remained closed and unused since his family's death. The irony wasn't lost on him that this room meant for new life was now serving as a sanctuary for someone the world had cast aside. Ayana recovered her physical strength quickly under James's care. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke clearly. Regular meals, clean water, a safe place to sleep, and most importantly, no questions about her past. She had expected suspicion, demands for explanations, or worse. Instead, she found herself in the presence of someone who seemed to understand the value of silence and the healing power of simple kindness. On the morning of her 8th day at the ranch, Ayana woke to find James already gone, attending to his cattle in the far pasture. For the first time since her arrival, she felt strong enough to truly explore her surroundings. The ranch house was modest but well maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his work despite his solitude. In the kitchen, she noticed the way he had organized everything with military precision, though dust gathered on the settings for two at the dining table, as if he couldn't bring himself to put them away. It was in the main room that she found the photograph. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile holding an infant. The woman bore no resemblance to James with her dark hair and delicate features, but the love in her eyes as she looked at the camera was unmistakable. This, Ayana realized, was why James McKenna understood pain. Like her, he had lost his family, though death rather than rejection had been the thief. When James returned that evening, he found Ayana had prepared a simple meal using ingredients from his well-stocked pantry. The sight of another person moving through his kitchen, bringing life to spaces that had been hollow for so long, created an unexpected tightness in his chest. "You didn't have to," he said, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "I wanted to," Ayana replied, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "My grandmother taught me to cook before—" She paused, then finished simply, "before." They ate in comfortable silence, the evening light filtering through the windows and casting long shadows across the wooden floors. It was James who finally broke the quiet. "The woman in the photograph," Ayana said carefully. "She was your wife?" James nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Sarah. She and our son Thomas died in the influenza outbreak 5 years ago. Thomas was only 6 months old." "I'm sorry," Ayana said, and her words carried the weight of someone who truly understood loss. "My father died when I was 12. Raiders from another tribe. My mother, she was never the same after." "Is that why they cast you out?" James asked gently. Ayana set down her spoon, considering how much to reveal. "They said I brought bad luck, that my dreams were curses." She looked up at him, searching his face for signs of the fear she had grown accustomed to seeing. "I sometimes dream things that later happen. People died after my dreams. They blamed me." James studied her for a long moment. In the lamplight, she looked even younger than her 17 years, and he could see the weight of rejection in her dark eyes. "Dreams aren't curses," he said finally. "Sometimes they're just warnings nobody wants to hear." The relief that washed over Ayana's face was visible. For the first time since her exile, someone had listened to her explanation without immediately reaching for weapons or making signs against evil. "My wife used to say that some people are born to see what others can't," James continued. "She said it was a gift, even when it felt like a burden." Over the following days, they fell into a natural rhythm. James would tend to his cattle and repair the endless small damages that ranch life demanded, while Ayana took care of the house and began helping with lighter tasks around the property. She proved to have a natural way with animals, calming nervous horses with gentle words in her native language, and helping James treat a sick calf with herbal remedies her grandmother had taught her. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as the desert air cooled, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in each other's company. James found himself sharing stories about Sarah and their brief time together, while Ayana spoke of her childhood before the dreams began, when her father was alive and her mother still smiled. It was during one of these conversations that Ayana asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Why did you help me? You could have turned me away, and no one would have blamed you." James was quiet for so long that Ayana thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain, "Because Sarah would have wanted me to, and because everyone deserves at least one person in the world who won't give up on them." As the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky, both of them felt something they hadn't experienced in years, the tentative beginning of hope, and the possibility that family might be something you choose rather than something you're born into. 3 weeks into their unlikely partnership, the fragile peace of James McKenna's ranch was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Ayana, who had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, recognized the distinctive rhythm of unshod hooves on hard-pan desert immediately. Apache riders, and from the way James tensed when he emerged from the barn, he recognized it too. There were 5 of them, warriors from her former band, led by her older brother Marcus Walking Bear. They rode with the confident bearing of men on a righteous mission, their faces painted for war and their weapons clearly visible. Ayana's stomach dropped as she realized they had come for her, and probably not with forgiveness in their hearts. James positioned himself between the approaching riders and Ayana, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Years of frontier life had taught him to project calm confidence even when his heart was racing. These weren't raiders or hostiles. Their approach was too direct, too organized. This was personal business, and that somehow made it more dangerous. Marcus Walking Bear drew his horse to a stop 20 feet from the porch, his dark eyes moving from James to his sister with an expression of cold disappointment. When he spoke, it was in rapid Apache, his words carrying the weight of family authority and tribal law. "Sister, you have brought shame to our family by living among the whites. You will come home now and face the judgment you ran from." Ayana stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear coursing through her. "I have no home with people who believe I am cursed, and I brought no shame, only the truth of what I saw in my dreams." "Dreams that killed Joseph Crow Feather," Marcus replied harshly. "Dreams that brought misfortune to our people. Mother was right to cast you out. But running to the whites makes you worse than cursed. It makes you a traitor." James had been following the conversation through the few Apache words he knew and the tense body language of both siblings. When he saw one of the other warriors shift his grip on his rifle, James decided it was time to intervene. "This is my land," he said in English, knowing Marcus would understand. "The girl is under my protection. If you have business with her, you can state it in a language I can follow." Marcus turned his attention to James with a look that mixed curiosity with contempt. "White man, my sister is Apache. Our family's shame is not your concern." "When someone seeks shelter on my property, they become my concern," James replied evenly. "If she chooses to leave with you, that's her decision, but I won't let anyone be taken from here against their will." The tension in the air was palpable as the 2 men sized each other up. Marcus was younger and arguably stronger, with 4 armed warriors at his back, but James had the advantage of position and the desperate determination of a man defending something he'd unexpectedly come to value. It was Ayana who broke the standoff. "Marcus, I won't go back. I can't live with people who blame me for their misfortunes and fear my dreams. This man has shown me more kindness in 3 weeks than our family showed me in my final year among them." Marcus's face darkened. "You speak like a white woman now. You dress like them, live like them. Have you forgotten who you are?" "I remember exactly who I am," Ayana replied, her voice gaining strength. "I am the daughter of Fierce Wolf, who taught me to stand up for what is right. I am the granddaughter of Healing Woman, who taught me that gifts should be used to help, not hidden in fear. And I am the sister of Marcus Walking Bear, who once protected me from bullies but now comes to drag me back to people who want me dead." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. For a moment, the warrior's mask slipped, and James could see the conflict in the young man's eyes. This wasn't just about tribal law or family honor. This was about a brother struggling with love and duty. "If you stay here," Marcus said quietly, "you can never come home. Mother will declare you dead to our family. The tribal council will put a price on your head for living among our enemies." Ayana felt James tense beside her, but she reached out and touched his arm gently, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by her brother. "Then I will be dead to them," she said with quiet dignity. "But I will be alive here, with someone who sees me as a person rather than a curse." Marcus looked between his sister and the white rancher, seeing something in their interaction that surprised him. There was no shame in Ayana's posture, no fear in her eyes when she looked at James. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't what he had expected to find. "You have until tomorrow at sunset," Marcus said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of finality. "After that, you are no longer my sister, and I cannot protect you from those who would hunt you." As the Apache riders wheeled their horses and rode away, James and Ayana stood together on the porch. both understanding that their peaceful interlude was over. The outside world had found them, and now they would have to decide how much they were willing to risk for the sanctuary they had built together. That night, as they sat by the fire, James asked the question they were both thinking. "Do you want to leave? I'll understand if you think it's too dangerous to stay." Ayana looked into the flames, then at the man who had become her unexpected guardian. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," James answered without hesitation. "But I need you to understand what staying might mean. If your brother is right about the tribal council, we could be facing more than just family disapproval." Ayana nodded slowly. "I understand, but I also understand that some things are worth fighting for." She met his eyes across the firelight. "Are you willing to fight?" James McKenna looked at this young woman who had brought life back to his empty house and purpose back to his hollow days. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am." Outside, the desert wind carried the promise of coming storms, but inside the small ranch house, two unlikely allies prepared to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The attack came 3 days later, not from Marcus and his warriors as they had expected, but from an entirely different threat. James was repairing a water trough near the barn when he heard the thunder of hooves approaching fast from the east. These weren't Apache ponies. These were shod horses ridden hard, and that meant white men with unclear intentions. Sheriff Tom Bradley led the group of 6 mounted men, his silver badge catching the afternoon sun, as he brought his horse to a sliding stop in front of the ranch house. James recognized most of the riders, ranchers from the surrounding area, a few townspeople from nearby Millerville, and Deputy Pete Garrison, whose hatred for all Apache was well known throughout the territory. "McKenna!" Bradley called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office, but also something harder underneath. "We need to talk." James walked slowly toward the group, his hand resting casually near his revolver. Behind him, he could sense Ayana watching from the kitchen window, and he hoped she would have the good sense to stay hidden until he understood what was happening. "Sheriff," James nodded, "what brings you all the way out here?" "Reports of you harboring a hostile Apache," Deputy Garrison spoke up before Bradley could answer. "Word is you've got yourself a squaw living here, and that ain't right by any measure." James felt his jaw tighten at the crude language, but he kept his voice level. "I don't know what you've heard, but there's no hostiles on my property." "Marcus Walking Bear came into town 2 days ago," Sheriff Bradley said, dismounting from his horse. "He told quite a story about his sister taking up with a white rancher, said she was cast out for witchcraft and cursing the tribe." "And you believe everything an Apache tells you?" James asked, though he could see from the men's faces that they very much did believe it. "I believe in keeping the peace," Bradley replied, "and a white man living with an Apache woman who's been accused of witchcraft is the kind of thing that starts range wars. You know the situation out here is tense enough without adding fuel to the fire." Rancher Bill Hutchins, whose spread was the closest to James's property, leaned forward in his saddle. "McKenna, you've always been a decent neighbor, but this is crazy. You can't trust these people, especially not one their own tribe threw out." "The girl's dangerous," added Deputy Garrison. "If her own people say she's cursed, what business do you have protecting her?" James looked at the faces surrounding him and saw fear, prejudice, and the kind of mob mentality that made good men do terrible things. He also saw something else, the opportunity to finally take a stand for something that mattered. "Her name is Ayana," he said quietly. "She's 17 years old. She's never hurt anyone, and she's under my protection." "Damn it, James," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice showing strain. "Be reasonable. Turn her over to us and we'll make sure she gets back to her people safely." "Her people don't want her," James replied, "and I won't turn anyone over to a mob." It was then that Ayana appeared on the porch, having made the decision that hiding would only make things worse. She walked with the quiet dignity her grandmother had taught her, her head held high, despite the hostile stares of the mounted men. "I am Ayana, daughter of Fierce Wolf," she said in clear English. "If you have accusations against me, speak them directly." Deputy Garrison's hand moved toward his gun. "You see? Bold as brass. Just like all the hostiles. Probably putting a curse on us right now." "The only curse here is ignorance," Ayana replied calmly. "I have done nothing but exist, and apparently that is crime enough." Sheriff Bradley studied the young woman, taking in her neat appearance, her composed manner, and the way she stood close enough to James to show solidarity without hiding behind him. Whatever he had expected to find, this wasn't it. "Miss," he said carefully. Your brother says you were exiled for bringing bad luck to your tribe. Says people died after your dreams. Ayana met his gaze steadily. People die, Sheriff. Sometimes I dream about it before it happens. That doesn't make me responsible for their deaths any more than a weather vane is responsible for the storm it predicts. But you admit you have these visions? Bill Hutchins asked, his voice tight with superstitious fear. I dream, Ayana said simply. Just as you do. The difference is that sometimes my dreams show truth. James stepped closer to Ayana, making his position clear to everyone present. Sheriff, I've known this girl for almost a month now. She's helped me with my ranch, never caused any trouble, and shown nothing but kindness to every living creature on this property. If that's what you call dangerous, then maybe we need to rethink what danger really means. Deputy Garrison spat in the dust. McKenna, you're thinking with something other than your brain. No white man takes any Apache unless he's getting something in return. The implication in his words hit James like a physical blow, and for a moment the careful control he'd maintained threatened to snap. Garrison, if you've got something to say it plain. I'm saying a man who's been alone as long as you have might make poor decisions when a young woman shows up needing help, Garrison replied with an ugly smile. James took a step forward, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt. And I'm saying you'd better be real careful about what you're suggesting. Sheriff Bradley quickly moved between the two men. That's enough. Pete, keep your mouth shut. James, we're not here to cause trouble, but the situation can't continue as it is. Why not? James asked. Because people are afraid of what they don't understand. Because it's easier to drive out a young woman than to question their own prejudices. Because Marcus Walking Bear gave us a message for you, Bradley said heavily. If his sister isn't gone by the end of the week, he and his warriors will come take her. And if any white men try to stop them, it'll be seen as an act of war by the tribal council. James felt Ayana stiffen beside him, but her voice remained steady. My brother is trying to protect me in the only way he knows how, but I won't be driven away by threats. And I won't abandon someone who's done nothing wrong, James added firmly. Sheriff Bradley looked around at his men, seeing the mix of fear, anger, and frustration on their faces. He was a fair man trying to keep peace in an unfair world, and he could see that this situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. James, he said quietly, I've got to ask you one more time. Will you turn the girl over to us voluntarily? James looked at Ayana, seeing the trust in her eyes and remembering his promise that she would always have at least one person who wouldn't give up on her. No, Sheriff, I won't. Bradley nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then I hope you know what you're doing, because come the end of the week, I won't be able to help you. As the posse rode away, James and Ayana stood together on the porch, watching the dust cloud disappear toward town. They both understood that the easy part was over. Now they would discover just how much their unlikely alliance could withstand. Are you afraid? Ayana asked quietly. James considered the question seriously. Yes, he said finally, but not of your brother or his warriors, and not of the townspeople. What then? James looked at this young woman who had brought light back into his dark world, who had given him something worth fighting for when he thought his fighting days were over. I'm afraid of failing you, he said honestly, of not being strong enough to keep the promise I made. Ayana reached out and took his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong as they intertwined with his. Then we'll be strong together, she said simply. My grandmother used to say that two people standing together can weather any storm. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, James McKenna and Ayana stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. They had found something rare and precious in each other, the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. The week ahead would test them both, but they would meet it as they had met everything else since that first day when a dying girl stumbled onto a lonely man's land. Together, with hope, and with the unshakable conviction that some bonds are stronger than blood. Some families are chosen rather than born, and some sanctuaries are worth defending no matter what the world might say.